I think we're ready to start. So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to welcome you all here to the French Presidency on Aylesbury Road, where we're co-hosting this event to celebrate women in business with our partner, the French Embassy here in Ireland. And we'd like to thank His Excellency Vincent Guérend for inviting us into the home this afternoon. So we have also the opportunity to welcome today Dearbhail McDonald, who is a very well-known journalist, broadcaster, and also a Global Eisenhower Fellow. And Dearbhail, you're very welcome. And Dearbhail, in fact, has strong connections with France because, in fact, Dearbhail is on the leading the strategy committee for the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris. And so she is a keen traveller to and from Ireland and France. So Dearbhail, thank you for moderating, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Ok, merci à vous. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Je suis très honorée d'être parmi vous cet après-midi pour célébrer les femmes dans le monde des affaires et de l'entreprise. Aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, il est essentiel de soutenir les femmes et plus particulièrement les femmes qui souffrent des persécutions. C'est un début d'année très important pour la France qui assure la présidence du Conseil de l'Union européenne. Je remercie la Chambre de commerce franco-irlandais qui nous a invités cet après-midi. Et finalement, je voudrais remercier son Excellence Vincent Guérend, l'ambassadeur de France en Irlande, qui nous reçoit en cette fin d'après-midi. You will be relieved as much as I am that that's the last of the French you'll be hearing from me this afternoon, but I'm learning, I'm trying. E1 exams in April. I need all of your love and support for that. But good afternoon, everyone. You're very, very welcome. Happy International Women's Day to each and every one of you. It's a celebration, but I'm sure that you, like me, feel it's a very challenging year, not least because of events that are happening in Ukraine and seeing the masses of women and children who are now fleeing all across Europe and seeking help. I think that now more than ever, this is an important time to reflect and consider the role and status of women. It's an even more important year for France, which, as you'll have heard in my bad French, has assumed the presidency of the Council of the European Union. It's a very, very important role that it has, and it has two specific strategic aims in respect of women. And I'd like to invite His Excellency Vincent Guérend. I was practicing with my French teacher to get right. To share his just some thoughts on the presidency and what is being achieved. So, Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dearbhail. And I'm very grateful for such a distinguished panel to have gathered today at the invite of the Chamber of Commerce. Indeed, we're all here to discuss about business, women in business, but it's true also that the cause of gender equality, of the promotion of women is also key presidency of the EU Council, as was mentioned. There's a lot has been achieved already, but there's so much more to be done throughout Europe. And so it's certainly necessary, not sufficient, but necessary at least once a day a year to reflect and pose and see how to move forward. And so when it comes to the French presidency, there are similar debates taking place throughout Europe. As I'm told, also the French president will also host an event tomorrow, and we have to raise awareness. We have to make sure also that the legal framework is conducive, promoting women as it should be, so that there's a fair representation of half of the European population, and that all kinds of gaps, pay gap, gender gap, are bridged and filled as quickly as possible. So I'm very grateful for this event, and now I'm listening with great interest what you may share with us.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ambassador. And just to remind everyone at home, I'm going to shortly introduce you to our panel, but today is a conversation that you are very, very much involved in. We would please say, send your thoughts, your observations, your comments into the chat function. We are going to get to as many of them as possible, and we want you to really take part in it, so please do. So who do I have with me today? To my left, I have Margot Slattery, who is the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at the ISS Group. She's also the President of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce, so it's great to have you with us today, Margot. I'm also joined by Stella Clark, who is the Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer for Fenergo, the President of CCEF. What is that? I didn't do my work properly, Stella.
So the CCEF actually is a trade advisors of French and Irish business professionals who are here basically to promote and facilitate and arrange basically businesses across France and Ireland. And we are under the umbrella of the French Embassy, and we basically collaborate with the French Chamber of Commerce as well.
Fantastic, Stella, thank you. It's easier to introduce my next guest, Noelle O'Connell, because she just has one title. She is, of course, the CEO of the European Movement Ireland. We had hoped as well to be joined by Flavie Moto, who's the head of HR at BNP Paribas, but she couldn't be with us today, and I know she just sent her regards. But as you're going to see, there's going to be no problem stopping these ladies talking. And I'm going to start by asking a controversial question, which is, how do you feel about International Women's Day? You know, people can have mixed views, women can have mixed views about it, but Margot, do you think it's important, and is it important that we get out every year to celebrate, to highlight whatever we need to do?
I think, thank you, Dearbhail, and it's a great question. I think it's incredibly important in so many ways. You know, firstly, I think, and it's not that I want to sort of put that word, the battle out there, but the things that we need to do, the changes that we need to do have not been done. The gender pay gap, the parity gap, and the world and safety for women is a long ways off. So a lot of work to be done. What I do think is also important, though, when we discuss all of these, is to also remember, and you spoke to it, Ambassador, is to celebrate, and to celebrate women and to celebrate our achievement. And when I look in our own country here in Ireland, you know, we've made much progress in 100 years, but my God, it's been slow. And so I think, you know, if we continued at that pace, we'd still be sitting here, I think, having this discussion in a couple of years. So we need to see an acceleration and change. So important to have it, but important to, I think, put speed and expediency on it.
Is it an important day for you, Stella?
For me, it's an important day, but a little bit bittersweet today, because I'm really thinking about the events that are happening in Ukraine. Yes. And it just reminds all of us that actually just a chance to be able to celebrate International Women's Day, it's pretty unique, and it can only take place in a peaceful environment and in a democratic type of society. Otherwise, there'll be even no discussion or no possibility to celebrate when you really go back to the basis and you're basically fleeing for your life and looking just to care about your family and your children, leaving your husband behind to go and fight. I think it's also, you know, a reminder that it's a chance to be able to celebrate, and I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity today to talk about it.
Noelle, probably had events not unfolded in Ukraine, some of the criticisms against International Women's Day might be levelled. People might say, well, it's late. It's all about women on boards. It's, you know, that perhaps it's a privileged conversation. But what are your feelings on it? As I say, I think that what's happening in Ukraine has really reminded us probably why we need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose a bit like what others have said, Dearbhail, I've kind of mixed views. It's an honour to be on such a distinguished panel as this, and I think celebrating International Women's Day and women's accomplishment and achievements is fantastic, and we of course should do that. But equally, and you know, being a little bit controversial, the flip side of that is, why are we celebrating something that's 50% of the population? Why is it, to Margot's point about the glacial pace of change? I mean, I'm reminded that this year in Ireland, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Ireland joining the EEC. And when we joined, women who were married working in the civil and public service had to give up their job. A woman couldn't order a pint in a bar, you know, and that's not that long ago. I know I'm very conscious I'm in the French residence. I'm talking about Ambassador, apologies. But, you know, when we look back and see the changes, and I know under the French presidency, there are very ambitious agenda for enhancing and improving gender empowerment and equality, as Margot outlined. But I think it's how do we make it resonate and be impactful? And for me, we're not going to achieve all we can unless we bring men with us and have men champions and have men allies. So how do we do that?
Well, before the only man on our panel leaves, I'm about to ask you other commitments this afternoon, but there are two strategic aims in respect of gender equality for the presidency: to advance a directive on equal treatment and to try and change council conclusions aimed at combating in particular gender-based violence. How close is France and its partners on those two goals?
I think on both is broadly speaking a very strong commitment of all member states, maybe short of a couple of them, to move forward on treatment and on salaries. This is something which is now very much mainstream across member states, north, east, west, south. It's maybe when you talk about social dimension, when you talk about violence, some cultures are maybe less than others, and it's more difficult. Some will tell you, well, that's not a new affairs, it's a national affairs, it's a cultural affairs, nothing to do with GP level. But we will continue, and there are also some fundamental rights enshrined in the EU Charter, which actually are very, very clear about equality between men and women and the right to have a safe and protected life. So we will certainly push with a lot of political emphasis on the adoption of the relevant text.
I know you have to leave us, so if you do, don't worry, we'll keep on having the chats. But Ambassador, you did pick up on something very interesting, which is the role of culture and cultural differences in different countries. And I wonder, Margot, you know, you've worked for mega companies, you're managing workforces across so many different countries. How important that is kind of the role of culture in the end forward, whether it is legal, social, cultural, it's not a uniform thing.
Yeah, I think, and it's a really, really important point to consider. You know, you can have the culture of an organization, which can be really positive, and both the big organizations I've worked for over the last number of years, both organizations, one French, one Danish, are really super progressive in this space, and the culture is all about change and transformation. But then you try to do it in a country, and that's where you can come unstuck very quickly. So you can have a global and you know, we can all desire to do the best thing, and then you can go to a region or a culture that is incredibly different. And if I, you know, give an example, and I was chatting to you earlier on a different subject, but chatting about, for instance, you know, I saw somebody, one of my colleagues sent me something, and it was from Indonesia, and it was from how to hit your wife gently, and this was guidance from the government. And the minister who had put this out was actually thinking they were doing a good thing, because the previous thing had been, you know, hit your wife hard. So they thought they were actually coming and making for a change.
That it was culturally
acceptable, and they were actually making improvements. You know, and when you, for instance, in some countries, start talking about gender balance, and you start trying to talk about equality, people are looking at you sometimes, you know, really as if you're sort of talking about something really phenomenally different. So, and then of course you're in some parts of the world where this is just very much acceptable, and this conversation is part of what we look at every day. So the culture, I think, is incredibly important, and the leadership that then helps to bring that change.
A ministerial guide to how to hit your wife gently was not what I was expecting. Sorry, we started this afternoon's conversation. But Noelle, just on that, the culture, whether it is culture at an organisational level, societal, or even intra countries, is that something that you've come across, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, I was struck by that. Wearing, if I may, I better get this plug in, because I'll be given out. I was delighted to hear that you're studying for your B1, because I'm on the board of the Alliance Française. So it's great to see. I need to get a plug in for the Alliance. So
I might chase a discount on my next fees then.
No, it's important on the language learning. No, but the culture, to that point, It was very interesting. There's a really interesting conversation happening in Europe at the moment, if I might mention it. It's the world's largest exercise in participatory democracy, and it's called the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I'm going to be heading to Strasbourg on Thursday. In fact, I'm going to be living in Strasbourg for the next 2 months years. But that debate is taking place, 800 citizens from the 27 countries. And they're talking, Dearbhail, to your point about, culture. How do we make the EU better? How do we make our shared European home better? And what values do we hold dear? And not all are uniform to what Margot was mentioning. But I was really inspired, coming back to Stella's point, about the 200 citizens we had in Dublin Castle last week. And one of the random Irish representatives stood up in front of 200 people and said, what is happening in Ukraine is not acceptable. I want us to do a group photo of everyone. So all, the translators, the facilitators, the whole group, 200 citizens went outside and expressed that culture. And that to me is, is emphasizing solidarity with what is going on and what Ukrainian families are suffering. And from a leadership and from dealing with it kind of, I suppose, at a European level, it's respecting as well the differences, Dearbhail. And I think if we can see, I was always struck by what an inspiration Ireland was to many of our neighbours further east in terms of the marriage equality, in terms of the various citizen assembly types referendum. And I think we need to remember that we are a shining light as well in some ways for these, and particularly remember that for International Women's Day.
Yeah, I think we've got better probably, possibly because we have had so many referendums, I never know which is correct, that we are better at conversation. But Stella, just on that point on culture, you're a French woman in Ireland, you're raising a family here. Do you see the cultural differences at play in the business world?
Yes, to a certain extent. We were having this discussion, for example, you asked me a very interesting question. What do you think that there is maybe more French women who are engaged in the workforce and working, etc., versus Ireland? Because sometimes there is a difference. We see like women leaving the workforce. And I told you that the main reason I thought from a pure cultural things is how basically the state has been managing the childcare issues. And I think that in the French culture, as women, we do not see, the burden of raising children maybe the same way as Irish women might see it, and that maybe give us a little bit more easiness to go into the work and to continue working and maybe
to stay
in the workforce, because very often women enter the workforce, but then they might be dropping. Then might re-enter later when to have maybe more stability around that.
And Stella and I were talking this because a lot of people who are watching on Zoom will know that once upon a time, Ireland, and for a long time, held the highest fertility rate in Europe. And we have been displaced by France and by Sweden, largely, I think, Stella, because there was that critical differentiator, the investment in childcare, in early childcare, and that is probably because even Ireland has one of the most highly educated workforces in respect of women, but we've one of the worst rates when it comes to female participation. So I think culture is a big part of it. Not just culture, Margot, but also language. The importance of language sometimes, and particularly when you think of this year's topic of breaking the bias, the role of language is important too, isn't it?
Oh, incredibly important. And I think if I take this country, as a starting point, we grew up in a sort of a very one-dimensional mono type of language. Everything, if you think of it, even still business today is mostly and allow the ambassador to leave. You can go comfortably.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We grew up, we're still even having the debate about using the word chairman. And language about jobs and who does what. You still in Ireland, it's spoken about the thing is very gendered, and we are only recently, for instance, beginning to change that around sport. I would certainly have had the experience, and some of my colleagues here, when I was a female CEO and you even went to a restaurant or anything, you weren't even usually brought the bill or the wine list. Now, it'd be quite good if someone else would take the bill for you. But and again, it's that sort of very much seen as power and representation is seen as being male. Yeah. And then we see that, I think, across the whole of the rest of Europe. I mean, one of my challenges when you do work in D&I is to actually always try and challenge this stereotype. And I noticed that 90% of the time when we talk about money, power and authority, it's got a male language.
Yeah, absolutely. And right down to job advertising.
Exactly.
Everything, what we kind of tune in and tune out of. One of the most topics that we frequently go back to on International Women's Day is the role of women in boards. And Stella, it matters because it infiltrates right down through the executive and the whole staffing levels. Are you a fan of quotas?
Look, I'm not a fan of quotas, but quotas have worked pretty well. So I just wanted to give you an example. In France, 10 years ago, there was a legislation passed to encourage, to push up to 40% women representation in boards in listed companies. And if you look at it, it has really helped to change basically, the spectrum. And now all these boards are eating 40%. The problem now, and I was looking at some of the statistics from European Women in Boards, which have a super report, and they were saying that while on average in Europe, out of 606 listed companies, 35% of women of board were composed of women. The next basically challenges was really the representation of women in the decision maker, so in the executive level. Yes. And just to give you another example, the numbers were only 19%. So 35 in board, 19% in decision making, with only 15 women CEO, and only 169 of this company had at least one female in C-suite. Okay, so to me, and so maybe just getting this example, showing to you that quotas have worked. So maybe what do we do next? And should we have legislation, in that kind of pushing more representation of women now in the executive level, and should it be mandatory? Now, I think quota are not enough, and I was actually relooking at some of the stats from the US, which is slightly different and maybe a little bit behind Europe. And interestingly, in the US, a lot of progress has been made, especially in the S&P 500 companies, for sure. And you look at what are the 4 reasons for that. The first one is institutional investor mandates. Large institutional investor are basically shareholders of company, and they push basically the change in the companies they invest in. And I think that's one of the 4s. The second is legislation, but in the US it's state-based, so it will depend on the state. So some are not. The third one was proxy advisory firms, so the one representing the small shareholders, and voting and acting on behalf of the shareholder, also pushing the change. And the 4th one was stock exchange themselves, where NASDAQ, for example, is kind of threatening to delist companies who will not hit their target in terms of gender diversity, etc. So quotas works well, but what's next? Even more.
It's interesting as well, because like many women, sorry, I'm going to come to it now because I was specific, but like many women, we might not like the idea of quotas, but we love the results. It worked particularly well electorally in getting many women in Ireland onto the tickets. But and obviously there are going to be further changes. What Stella really brought up was a whole mix of things, but regulation and legislation, what role do you think it has to play?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think that whole ecosystem is something that if we could marry all those different threads and strands, it's interesting to follow on, Stella, from your point. Back in November 2012, the European Commission proposed a proposal in terms of 40% for executive boards, a 40% target, of which, let me just say, 18 of the 27 countries supported it. But interestingly, France, according to the European Institute for Gender Equality, had the highest number of women in boardrooms at 45%, compared to a wider EU average of 30%, and Ireland came in at 30.2%. So, and then we look at Dearbhail, we know at in terms of women for election, politicians. My own of Cork with 18 TDs, members of Parliament, we only have one female. So how do we get that balance right? And I think that's always a challenge, isn't it? I mean, the saying, everyone likes quotas, doesn't like quotas, but likes the result. And until we see, I think, I've been amazed at how quickly things have happened in relation to Ukraine, and the pressure
when the situation demands and the crisis demands.
Yeah.
There are some interesting parallels there. Margot, is it fair to say that asking nicely has not worked?
Yes, it is fair to say. In my opinion,
it's not working. So what Stella is talking about, it is a combination of the legal, but the leadership has to be there too.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think we have a great example in Ireland in the better balance for business, the leadership from government, from society, but also from business getting in there and having to make.
Is there not the case that one of the reasons why business moved, because the business case had been well set out?
Yes, it had. And but I think, and I want to kind of come back on what something Stella said, which is, I think also the ESG part and the investors were really pushing it. And I think boards have come to that end of the line, and, they're sitting there and realizing you cannot no longer sit there and just have no women on your board. And I mean, what was happening here in Ireland was we saw naming and shaming was happening, because when Better Balance for Business were publishing the reports, they were literally calling out the 5 Irish listed companies who had no women on their boards. And people were then literally going, God, I support them. They've not, because you could hear that conversation. And maybe to even, I think, come back and put more even on it, Stella, is that what we're seeing as well, that unions and I think those who are really wanting to make societal change are now no longer, saying, let's go out and march or protest. They're actually putting, they're influencing the investors and they're getting people on boards. And that's going to also pull a change on it.
So is it, Stella, then a combination of regulation in the form of state regulation or coming from Europe, but as well as kind of it's a governance risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were discussing it. So I see it at two levels. First of all, we talk a lot about listed companies, and because they are listed, they tend to have higher level of regulation, legislation.
But the private world?
But the private world, which is, I will say, the majority of where women are working, everywhere, need a lot more push. And I think this can be driven through governance and through ESG, and ESG being, the shareholder putting the pressure, but then, as you say, the employee as well. There is different group, that can play an active role to kind of promote these changes. Now, do we need quotas? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, can this be sufficient? I'm pretty optimistic because I'm really seeing a lot of emphasis on ESG right now. And in companies, in a set of policies, to achieve, and one of them is about gender diversity, but also the pay gap that you mentioned, diversity to a wider as well groups, in society that are underrepresented in general. Plus the last one is basically, the climate and basically social responsibility, in general towards that. So I believe in this force. But it has to accelerate, and sometimes, the law and the politician can help, to give that nudge.
Noelle, Stella raises an important point, because perhaps one of the criticisms of International Women's Day is that certain groups have got to celebrate it. And in one sense, we are privileged here to be celebrating women in business, but a lot of these measures are affecting women who are not, are in lower socioeconomic classes, don't have the same opportunity, who probably need the protections more than, thankfully, any of us might need on this panel today. But how do you go about then changing that culture? Because in one sense, somebody will look after the big business, but it's actually what it trickles down into the other parts of the economy, and especially in a country such as Ireland, which is SMEs are the backbone of the economy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that directive that I spoke about, it's for companies with more than 250 employees. So if to your point, Dearbhail, a lot of the smaller companies here wouldn't even have to subscribe to the guidance and the regulation that it's there. So I think it's interesting. It's the younger generation. I really see it as well. It's the values that your organization or your company or your business represents, and they're voting with their feet. The jobs market is really hot at the moment. There's a lot of movement, and if organizations or businesses or companies don't espouse and represent the best values that you hold dear, and obviously for most people, thankfully, equality is one of them, then you know, people are kind of voting with their feet. And I mean, you know, even in terms of purchasing products or different bits and pieces, I saw it with the Brexit referendum. Certain products that were made, you know, and certain things would not have been as popular with people, but we won't rehash the Brexit war. But I think, you know, it's just it's part of how do we make it resonate, and how do we make it relatable for everyone? And as you said, Dearbhail, we are really privileged to be here marking and celebrating it, but I think it needs to kind of go beyond and be more widespread, but also not encouraging a backlash, if I can put it that way, because I think it has to be wider and broader and kind of resonate amongst all of us. I don't have an easy solution or an answer to that, but I think we can't stop trying.
Just a quick sort of, I suppose, addition is, I think we have to look, and particularly you'll know this, Stella, from France, but the whole piece of collective discussion. So works councils, you know, looking at, for instance, minimum wages, living wages, where we start to look at how do we build childcare into part of people's benefits and those kind of things. I think those are some of the ways of achieving it. And obviously making sure that there is, and I think you spoke to it, Stella, diversity and inclusion at a wider level. So thinking of women of colour, people from the LGBT community, people with disability, etc., so that it's intersectional and we don't just see it in one way, and non-binary women, etc., as well. So again, having a broader spectrum view.
Just to remind everyone, I can't see how I know there are questions and everything coming into the chat function, but keep them coming in, because we're going to be coming to your questions or comments shortly. But one of the things we were talking about earlier was the improvement of the quality of the conversation. And Noelle, as you had been saying, you know, both the repeal the eighth referendum, the marriage equality referendum had been preceded by huge national conversations. And it seems to me that we're getting better. You know, we're now finally getting to talk about things like fertility, like miscarriage. We had, lest we forget during the pandemic, a week-long session led by Joe Duffy on Liveline about menopause. Yeah. It struck me that one man seemed to have done more about menopause than, than many of us have been trying for years, but it was phenomenal, the response from men as well as women. I have to say that it was from men as well as women. And most men don't even know that the next conversation is going to be about the andropause, but there is something about, don't worry, we'll get there, guys. But it is about including people in the conversation. I suppose maybe sometimes the odd thing I have about International Women's Day is I kind of think, well, where are the men? And obviously Ambassador Guérend has just left. But would you talk that risk of backlash perhaps goes, how do we include men in the conversation so that it's not perceived as a threat? Yeah.
No, it's and that's exactly, I think we have to, and it's something I'm really minded of and mindful of, that when we do events, insofar as we can, to actually have a balance and not, I know, well, we did have Vincent with us, we did have the ambassador with us, but, you know, just to make sure that there is, I suppose, that, you know, that a balance is there. I was asking colleagues in Brussels, just from their perspective, what do they feel about International Women's Day? And they said to me, they said, well, do you know what day tomorrow is? And I said, or sorry, the day after tomorrow. Are we meant to be, we're meant to be pretending today's, anyway. Tomorrow, the day after tomorrow is International Plumbers Day. Right, and their view was, well, what are you doing to celebrate International Plumbers Day? And I was like, well, thankfully we don't have any plumbing issues at the moment, but I suppose, you know, to being a bit like, not, you know, trying to get men involved, and to Margaret's point about diversity and inclusion, I'm really struck by seeing what's going on again at the conference on the future of Europe, and just seeing you know, women of different colour having their say and putting forward those perspectives, and also having young men speak very powerfully about gender equality. And I think the more that we can see of that, the more we do that. And it's bringing them into the conversation.
Stella and I had been discussing earlier, I wrote and produced a documentary on fertility, and one of the striking things about it was that by constantly framing fertility as a women's issue, we overlooked the fact that men's sperm counts had dropped dramatically in the last 40 years, with huge knock-on consequences for men's health in terms of that. And it's amazing sometimes if you just flip the lens, you know, because our issues are not just women's issues, they're everyone's issues. And I was just wondering, Stella, obviously France is renowned for its robust debate, but where are men in these conversations in France?
Look, I think many men are involved in this conversation. You know, I think we are really like going into a next stage. And I will say that just from my perspective, it's also maybe a change in generation to be really transparent. I mean, when I speak with my dad, you know, he's in his 80s. He grew up in a certain culture with certain views and a different time. And I guess, you know, for him, it will be really involuntary sometime maybe to say something or to be not, you know, in the right kind of tone. But if I look at the younger generation that you are mentioning, I'm actually thinking everything starts with education. And I think that, you know, we need to be mindful that we all have our background, we all have our, as you say, our culture, where we grew up, etc. But this can be changed, and this will be changed through basically education in particular of both young women and young men to be able to be part of this discussion and not to see gender as being a divide. But basically just to be part of the same conversation. So, and I will say that in France, at least from as a French person looking at the education system and the kind of discussions that happen, and also if I look at the ratio of men and women going into tertiary education, etc., we are really going into the right direction. Now, I will say it's slowly happening. Maybe not fast enough to your point, Margot, but I really feel it has to come with a change in how we educate and explain, you know, issues before we really get there.
And I mean, France, like Ireland, has its challenge. I was struck by how the issue of femicide and domestic abuse was so prominent in many countries, but became a significant issue during the pandemic in France. And Margot, there was an interesting but in some terms frightening poll out earlier this week for International Women's Day that Ipsos had produced still a very, very strong residue of people who don't see gender inequality and gender-based violence as an issue. And what really struck me about that poll was that some younger men, like up to a quarter of younger men, did not see these as issues. And that kind of really worried me as well about the quality of the conversations we're having.
And it worries me as much. I think the difficulty is that also people, probably because of technology, are often sometimes divided and see things very differently. Without getting into a bigger discussion about pornography and all of that, there are some thoughts around that. And, you know, kind of the whole respect about women that we may have seen in the past in some ways that could have been quite positive is sometimes missing. And then there are other, I think, there are positives on the other side or the converse of that. I mean, the truth is, I think for particularly workplace, and so many of our members are in the workplace scenario, gender-based violence is a really big issue. And if you bring it to a very basic business case, is the cost of gender-based violence on your work. Yeah.
4 billion a year.
Wow, I didn't even know what that figure was.
366 billion a year to the European economy. Of gender-based violence, of which 90% is affecting women in respect of gender-based violence. It's a phenomenal cost. I often think, God, if a business was managing, you know, a deficit like that, what would they do? It's interesting though, Stella, you know, that businesses are now facing challenges that previously they may have thought that it wasn't really their domain. You know, so we've had workplace policies around bullying, we've had workplace policies around lots of different things, perhaps even pay and pensions, but possibly gender-based violence, which is, I suppose, a subset of gender inequality, is one of the final taboos we have to face.
Yeah, definitely. And it's still a taboo, you know, in many ways. I mean, every company will have its escalation policy and whistleblowing, etc. But it's still taboo, you know, as you say, like there's this perception that this is not an issue in the workplace. But at the end of the day, as you say, absenteeism, for example, could be a very big sign of potential violence at work.
Productivity.
Everything increase, etc. Which means that, you know, I really believe that as managers, it's also a responsibility to try to go maybe a little bit beyond what we think is our responsibility in terms of performance assessment, etc., to really try to understand maybe some deeper reasons that might explain dip in productivity or absenteeism in particular. But I will say it's definitely not systematic or, you know, industrializing in the way, you know, many company operates. I don't know, Margot, what's your experience on this?
I mean, exactly as you say, Stella, I think it's something that's new, it's a challenging discussion. The only thing I think I can certainly say, and I saw it in Sodexo in the past, is when we started chatting about this and then thought about how can we as a business be a force for good around this, there was an amazing opportunity then to uncover that discussion in our business. So very simple, I want to age everyone, very simple example. We looked at, for instance, we were a huge provider of healthcare services and in hospitals, and we thought, how can we, you know, train our team so when people come into our receptions or come into hospitals, because we're often in receptions in front of, how can we be that really positive first point of contact? So making people aware and conscientized to who might come in and what they might be suffering with. And by doing that and getting our executives aware and having that discussion, I think we opened it up as a company. And so I remember the first time I wanted to celebrate International Day of Gender Violence, and I don't mean celebrate it, but celebrate the discussion. You know, people were kind of going, why? And the next year, people embrace that. So I think, you know, the sense of, as you said, the absenteeism, the covering, because you know, it's terrible such a tragedy.
Yeah, it's such a beguiling term, intimate partner violence, but when it has such public policy impacts on it, and thankfully, and even conversations like this are helping it. Noelle, I want to go back to you on the pandemic, because people might feel very, very mixed about its effects, and thankfully we're coming out of it. Look at us, we're in person here at least. But you know, was it a setback for women? Did it roll back a lot of the achievements that had been achieved? Or are women going to be suffering from proximity bias if they elect to work from home? You know, what are your kind of views on it now that we're hopefully heading out?
Well, firstly, isn't it great that we're all here and it's not 2 meters with yellow duct tape between all of us? Screens. And screens, exactly. So yes, sadly, I do think the pandemic put somewhat of a screeching halt to many of the progressions that had been in train and the momentum building, but not irreversible. I mean, I think we can certainly hopefully kind of reignite the momentum. I think sadly the pandemic, the burden of childcare, the burden of overwork, and I think particularly as you spoke so eloquently in terms of the intimate partner violence and all that, it's taking place behind closed doors, and the pandemic sadly facilitated that with the remote working. Now I think as we transition out to the new normal, to the better normal, it's getting that hybrid right. How do we as businesses, as employers, as organizations, how do we facilitate people wanting to have that flexibility of the remote working, but equally ensuring that people are still going to have the creativity and team building and morale and, as you
and progression,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, I mean, I think for a lot of the younger workforce, they may not necessarily see the advantages of learning and being on site and being present. So I think there is an element of wanting to stay fully remote for some. But I do think that balance, because we're humans, we're social beings, people need contact, and it's proven that we do, that creativity and that blue sky thinking I think really can come from in-person events. But I would hope that the lessons and the takeaways from the pandemic won't be forgotten. And I think there's just so much, it just can seem a little bit overwhelming. And Eurofound, based here in Dublin, do great work on analysing living and working cultural traditions right across the EU. And some of the findings and the statistics are really, really worrying. So we want to keep the good things and ensure that the negative sides of it don't become entrenched.
And even the whole working from home debate is in itself a privilege, because many people didn't have that. Stella, where do you think, survey after survey in Ireland, Europe, all across the world showed that women were picking up more of the childcare duties, more of the domestic duties. So for some, they may have embraced the flexibility, but for others, it increased their duties at home. Where do you think it will settle and could settle? Are we looking at a revolution in the future of work?
I think the way of working have definitely changed, and it's still a debate up there, but personally, I don't believe we will go back to where we were. I'm in line with what you were saying, Noel. It has to become an hybrid, type of working, because on one hand, working from home can bring a lot of flexibility to women or even to men who are working and have childcare duties, as long as you have childcare facilities that can basically take and look after your children when you're working. I think it's not possible to work with a child at home. That's basically what the pandemic has proven, and that's why maybe some women, and I've looked at some of the statistics, have dropped from the workforce during this period, because it was absolutely not possible, especially when the school closed down. I think that was terrible for any working parents, in general, to be able to manage that. But in a society or in a culture of business where you can have the flexibility of mixing days in the office and days at home, then this is an advantage to keep that flexibility. But I do agree with you, Noel, that as organization, we need to build a culture. And maybe that's what younger generation don't see, that culture are not built in one day. This is take years to be built. So I think a lot of organization might have been living up from what they had before and carry that through the pandemic. But as we are exiting the pandemic and we are already 2 years in, I think it's really time to be able to rebuild culture. And I think for creativity, we are social animals. There is an element of in-person that we need to be, doing, and it's about work organization and doing it smartly.
But it's also about buy-in, because Ireland was hailed as a wonderful country for introducing proposing the right to request to work from home. But if the recent Dáil debates were anything to go by, Margot, it's not going to be that simple. Nobody seemed to be happy with it. Some of the workers' representation said it didn't go far enough. Some of the business groups thought it was the wrong time, and that it wasn't right. So this isn't necessarily going to be an easy debate, because different people have different thoughts and ideas.
No, and I think we're nowhere near sort of having found the perfect panacea with it. And I don't see it as even just because I see it internationally. It isn't just in Ireland. I certainly see it in some of the countries we operate. However, and I think the part that will really...
How do you manage that for a company the size of ISS?
Well, I think it depends on the work you do. But I saw an amazing stat this morning on something I was talking to teams in Hong Kong, and I was looking at some global stats. And in 2020, it was about 26-27% that were working from home. 2021, it went up into the 30s. Working from home, purely working from home. And in 2022, it's nearing the 70s. Now, we know we're coming out of the pandemic, but I think there is a change that we will never go back on. And commute. And I see it, I was in the City of London last week and the week before, and what you see is, everyone will tell you, I see it in our own offices, people are in sort of Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays are lower, nobody's in on a Monday, nobody's in on a Friday. And I think we also have to think about usefulness and purpose. Why would somebody, and this is the thing I'm certainly challenging, why would somebody go into an office all day to sit in the office with a headphone on and do back-to-back on a computer calls? Because that's how most of us do business now. But if you're going in for a purpose to collaborate with colleagues, then there's absolutely.
I remember many people during the pandemic dying to get back to the office, from nearly from a mental health perspective, because they didn't maybe have a room of their own, an office of their own. It you know, just wasn't that. I think it's going to be really, really tricky to manage. And I want to ask you, Stella, just about women in STEM, because few areas have had as much discussion, intense discussions, really big seminars, everything about it. And yet when you look at and it matters because so much of the future is technology. It's who designs those apps, it's who designs that code, it's how our products, everything is built in. And I'm just wondering, like, why have we not perhaps made the advancement commensurate to the level of investment and discussion there has been about women in tech and women in STEM?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, but from my perspective, what I can observe is that while there is a lot of push to get women in STEM, the reality is that it's still very low numbers of young women who enter basically STEM degrees. That's a fact. You know, I was wondering what are the reason, you know, potentially behind, and I think that at the end of the day, we have to go back to culture and education. I still think that despite all the effort we are making, there is still a bias in our society that maths are not for girls.
And that is not necessarily one just held by men.
Yeah,
I think women can be equally as guilty of.
Exactly, and there is always this perception, and you know, I was giving you the example of my youngest girls, where I'm all about maths. You know, I tutor maths for my son who is doing his Living Cert and everything. I'm all into it. So really, I think as a role model, I'm not like against scientific subject. But still, my daughter came back from school. I was 9 at the time, and told me, look, you know, maths are not for girls. And I was like, what? And you're actually in the French school here in Dublin, you know? So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, maybe it's something to do with color kids are wearing when they are young. Maybe it has to do with, you know, playing with dolls, playing with cars. There is something fundamentally ingrained, which makes that as a choice, this subject are still not seen as far. And we have to ask ourselves, because at the end of the day, it's mathematical, you know, will depend how many young women enter these degrees to get qualified and then to be able then to enter the job in technology as a software developer or as a product manager or whatever role they want to take. And as long as we have this gap, we're not going to be able to close it, you know. So
how do we close the gap? Well, look, today is still a celebration despite everything else. And so my final question to each and every one of you is how do we turn the setback into a comeback? What is it that we're going to be able to do? What measures, apart from a benign female you know, dictatorship that we run for a couple of years until we get it right? What could we do? What would you, Margot, say? What are you optimistic about?
I'm optimistic about lots of things. And, you know, through the sadness even of Ukraine, and we began with it, I'm optimistic about the world's ability and the reaction and the empathy that's there. And actually, if I pick out something, that empathy, if we can start to rule the world and become more empathetic about how we actually work, act and play, I think that's really important. I think there's amazing young women in the world. And when I look to my generation, I think the next generation are fantastic, and the role models we've out there. And I suppose our voices are loud and proud, and I think that's going to be amazing. So whatever happens, it's going to be interesting and exciting, I think.
Yeah. For you, Stella, what are you excited about, optimistic about? What are you celebrating today?
For me, it's really like looking at them to you, like there is a young girl in my organization, one woman in my organization, sorry, you know, full of energy, socially very committed, you know, to all goals, whether they are social or, you know, environmental, etc. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think that as education is making progress and we ensure that more and more women across the world get education, that's the way. I really believe that's the way to get there. So it's the rising tide that lifts all boats. Noelle, when I look back on the last maybe 10 years,
the referendum, but other conversations have produced an extraordinary generation of young female activists, many of whom are now stepping into political roles, whether backroom teams, running for office, training for office. Is that what I think, maybe perhaps you're in that political world broadly, is that what excites you about maybe the next steps?
Yeah, I think the political with the non-partisan hat, I think definitely. I think women, we've come together and we're not going to be silenced anymore. We have our voice and that's there. And I think there's a greater awareness of that. And to I suppose the future, what is really striking me is that in the midst of all this tragedy and horror is the values, as Margaret outlined, but of empathy and of solidarity and of not taking what we thought we could take for granted anymore. Things like democracy, things like respect, things like the rule of law. And to see the unprecedented nature of the response. I mean, don't go into too heavy, but let's finish on an optimistic note. But I genuinely thought, and this is my area of, this is what I work in, but I have just been absolutely taken aback in the best positive sense by where there has been an aligning politically and an aligning societally and business-wise, and that intersection and that interface has really given me hope. I think for even in the midst of the tragedy that I'm just clinging on to that and hoping that this time next year for International Women's Day, when we're all in these surrounds and maybe we're partaking of some French produce in the evening, perhaps, that we'll be over the worst and we'll be looking forward to
as you say, sometimes it takes those hard yards, those difficult times to remind us of those values. Well, for me, I absolutely love International Women's Day. I love celebrating women. I love lifting them up. I love that it has become a much more inclusive conversation. I love that so many men are coming on board as our allies. And I've loved having been involved in this conversation today. Thank you to the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce, to Ambassador Guérend for hosting us here today. To you, wherever you are, happy International Women's Day. Our thoughts, of course, today with the women and so many more in Ukraine. Let's offer this one up for them. Thank you very much.